everyone. Welcome to the Concussion Discussions series brought to you by Integrated Brain Centers. I am your host, Amy Zellmer from Faces of TBI, and today I'm here with Dr. Nathan Keiser talking all about dysautonomia. So welcome to the series, Dr. Keiser.
Thanks. Happy to be here again. It's good to talk to you again, Amy.
Yeah. I think this is such an important subject. I think it's not talked about enough. I think a lot of people end up going to a cardiologist, and they don't get answers. And, you know, it's just kind of broadly missed and misunderstood out there in the medical community. So, I think it's great we're talking about it today. So maybe let's just start with, what is dysautonomia? What does that mean?
Okay. Great place to start because one, it's like a weird word.
Yeah.
So that always gets you tripped up. So if you just kind of start from the word part, your autonomic system, and most of you guys probably know if you've been following Amy and kind of keeping up with her work. But the autonomic system is just part of the way our brain works. So we have a central autonomic network, and then we've got a peripheral component. So like the central part is the computer part. And then you've got a peripheral system. And that's what we usually think about when you hear words like sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and that fight or flight or rest and digest. That's really the peripheral part once it's exited the brain. But the central autonomic nervous system is kind of the computer part inside the brain. So when we have different levels of TBI, whether it's, a concussion or even something like a whiplash in a car accident, all the way up to like severe TBI, we have the probability of damaging the pathways that are actually under autonomic control in the brain. So what does that mean? Like, what happens would be what we feel in dysautonomia, where that autonomic system kind of starts to go a little haywire. So we might notice that as like, we're not able to control the speed of our heart as well. We're not able to regulate our blood pressure as well. You might notice it in your pupils where you'll see, one pupil is bigger than the other, or they don't react the normal way. You might notice that your temperature regulation is different, or like you sweat a whole bunch or you don't sweat at all. Yep. You might notice even in your digestion, becoming gastroparetic. I think a lot of people experience after a head injury where all of a sudden, like, you just can't tolerate eating certain foods for a little while again, and your digestion's a little weird and things don't quite work the same. Sometimes people even get sensitive to different foods. So all these things that just run in the background of our life that we don't have to think about, that we don't control volitionally, our breathing, our heart rate, pupils, skin, all that stuff, that's all controlled by your autonomic system. So if we have those injuries in the brain, it can impact how that whole thing works, which is a bummer because it's usually not comfortable types of symptoms. And a lot of times they just kind of get, left out of the mix.
Yeah. Let's talk about, you mentioned the pupils. And I think this is something that's not talked about enough. And it comes up in my group a lot, like, hey, does anyone else have one pupil bigger than the other? And I know I had that issue. Like, it wasn't constant, but every once in a while, one would be noticeably bigger. And people would even say something to me like, what's going on with your eyes? Like, one pupil's bigger than the other. And the doctors were just like, yeah. So let's talk about that. Why does that happen?
That's a really good question. And it's one that a lot of people notice. And it's cool because you can look in the mirror and see like, oh boy, like that's a thing. So people can identify it really well. But basically, we have these, simple pathways in our brain that help us to regulate how much light comes in or out. So if you're in like a really bright room, we want to kind of close down that pupil, close down the amount of light that comes in, and that helps us see clearer. We've all been in a scenario where you're inside in like a dark room, maybe like you at the movie theater or like a bowling alley or something like that. And then you walk outside on a sunny day and it takes you a second to kind of regulate that. That's that pupil kind of constricting and being normal. A lot of times, and especially and this can be really helpful in brain injury, because if we actually injure our brain, there's kind of a difference when, like if something's toxic or a metabolic problem, it tends to affect our whole brain at once, like our whole body at once. When we get injured, sometimes it'll affect one area at a time or like a couple little focal areas. When we see there's a difference in left to right, what that's basically saying is we've got one pathway is working differently than the other side. And that's super helpful in helping us figure out which pathway is going wrong. But it's also really helpful to help us understand. It's kind of like a gas gauge or like an RPM gauge, where like when someone gets more fatigued, the ability to control that system might start to fail and that pupil gets a little bigger. Or if they've been exposed to something that's really hard or they felt overwhelmed by it, you might see that it gets a little harder to control, maybe more sensitive to light. Even sound to a degree will be associated kind of with that larger pupil. So it's a really good window to help us look at as a biomarker, to be able to see kind of which pathways is one side affected more than the other, but then also to be able to use it as a way to measure. One, if we're doing a rehab thing, a lot of people I'm sure do vestibular rehab, PT, chiropractic care, functional neurology care, all of it is associated with like, what's the right dose? How much is the right amount? Can we just do rehab until the cows come home and you do fine? Or do we do one little thing and you get tired? And a lot of times that pupil is a really good measure of how that's doing. So when it gets bigger, it tends to show us that like the brain's gassed a little bit, versus if they're holding tight and strong, then we're doing pretty well. So it's a really good tool to use. And even in people that have not been treated at all, if you notice, like I got one pupil that's bigger than the other, and sometimes it's better than others, you may be able to use that in your own life as like a little barometer for just how you're doing. Did you go for a drive and all of a sudden that thing's huge? Writing that down and being able to say, okay, well, let's try to see if we can do something to make it smaller again. Those are super valuable things, even if you don't have some of the resources that other people do.
That's really fascinating. I wish I'd have known that back in the day. Because, like it wasn't always noticeable, but then sometimes, like I said, other people would notice it. And that's when you know it's bad, when other people can see it.
For sure. Or they're really paying attention to you because they're looking deep in your eyes.
Yeah,
right?
there you go. So the pupil, that's great. That's something I think a lot of people might relate with. Another one I think would be that heart rate. And I know for me, my heart rate kind of went crazy right after my brain injury. And I've seen a lot of people post, they'll put a pulse ox on and they just stand there and their heart rate goes up and down and up and down. And they're literally just standing there. They're not doing anything. So what can that tell us?
Yeah, similar kind of thing. So you can imagine, we can kind of look at it from different ways. One, when you're just standing, it requires a different amount of feedback, right? Because it's different for your heart to have to pump blood up to your head than if you're laying down and it's just kind of flowing naturally to your head, right? So there are different components of vestibular receptors, the ability to kind of sense what's going on with where your head is at. When those systems fail, a lot of times we'll start to see that dysautonomia start to show a sign that's like a secondary sign that something's going on in that system. But then the other thing is that sometimes if your brain's not doing very well, right? If it's overwhelmed, if it's being overworked, then we can see that even just at rest, doing simple things, your body kind of has to act like it's exercising in order to meet those energy demands. And I think both of those are common. So it's very easy to be like, oh, you've got your heart rate's scooting up through the roof. It's hanging out at 120 or 150 or whatever it is. And then you just do this protocol and that should help it. But the reality is that's just a really good sign that something is wrong. It doesn't tell you what exactly is wrong. It tells you something is wrong, which gives you the point to then jump from there and say, is this something that is metabolic component where my brain is just getting tired? How do I figure out what's making it tired? Is it that I'm not able to regulate where my head is in space? Is it that I have a neglect syndrome? Is it that there's something wrong with my eyes? Is it something wrong with my neck? All those things can be kind of the causes. So in my work, like that's what I spend a whole bunch of time working on, is there's these heart rate components where it's very easy to see these little changes that happen in people that are abnormal and understanding where they're coming from and using that as a way to get them back. As you know, I mean, when your heart rate is screaming away on you, or when your blood pressure drops, that stuff sucks. You get super dizzy. You feel real anxious. Sometimes you feel like you're nauseous, just like the life is being sucked out of you. I mean, it is super uncomfortable. So I think especially with heart rate, you said you noticed like a lot of people would see your eye, but I think the heart rate component, when that starts acting up, is one that really grabs your attention. Is like, there's something going on here and we've got to solve this problem. So I think I see a lot more people that recognize like, this is bad.
Yeah.
And that drives a lot of people in. But I do also see, especially through Instagram and things like that, where people will identify as like, this is my problem, is that my heart rate is crazy. But then we usually have to take that extra step and say like, well, what is making your heart rate go crazy? And then that's where stuff really gets cool, because we can start to figure out what the problem is.
So this is a good like integration here. So often people end up going to the cardiologist because makes sense. That's what I did.
Yeah.
The heart rate's high, it's crazy. Like I walk 10 steps and my heart rate goes up to 150, right? Like shouldn't be that way. So a lot of people end up at the cardiologist, and I like I said, I ended up there. They did an EKG. They told me my heart was fine. Everything's just fine with your heart. But clearly something wasn't right. So, explain how, so we've got cardiology, a traditional medical doctor, but then we have the functional neurology, which is what you do. Explain the difference to people of how you look at this information versus what that cardiologist is looking at. Because he, like I said, he just basically did an EKG and was like, your heart's fine.
Yeah. Well, I use a cardiologist. I've had my own things in the past that have greatly benefited from that. But I think when you're thinking about those two different specialties, when you're as a cardiologist, my interpretation is kind of, we're looking at something wrong with the heart itself, right? And as long as the heart itself is capable of doing the thing it's supposed to, then we're usually pretty happy about that. Mm-hmm. But then if you back out a step and you look at this kind of neurocardiac loop, you realize that while the heart is capable of creating its own signals, it's really controlled by your brain, by reflexogenic systems in your brain. You can't will yourself to change your heart rate. You can't just be like, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's bring that sucker down to 65, please. I have too. It doesn't work.
It doesn't.
So these are very reflexogenic things. They're in your autonomic system. But the ability to look at that and say, if this is reflexogenic, it means that it's relying on this machine to operate the way it should. And then it makes everything kind of normal, so to speak, right? So if I'm exercising, my heart rate goes up. If I'm resting, it goes down. All of that is there to keep my blood pressure stable. So if my blood pressure is going up, then my heart rate should go down to help me stabilize my blood pressure. It's like thinking about putting your thumb over the hose, right? Mm-hmm. So if I want to squirt it farther, I squeeze a little harder and put more pressure. I constrict it down more pressure. If I want to bring the pressure down, I let off. And that's basically the way that pump works for the heart. So if we're thinking about it from like a neurocardiac perspective, we're really saying like, if that heart is working, but it's doing like, it operationally can do all the things it should do, but in the context or the moment that we are in, it's not doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. It means to say that the controller, the thing that should be kind of, back there steering the joysticks, is not doing the right thing. And if it's a reflex, it means you're not making choices about it. There's something in the way that machine is working that's failing. And I think that with my colleagues is where we really get excited, because it allows us to say, how can we dig into that machine and figure out how to make it work better again? Because it's going to have a huge impact on this person's life. And that's the part that's exciting. And you can extrapolate that to thinking about anything in the brain, but just really understanding like, looking at a system and then saying like, well, if there's a problem in the heart, we have a surgery we can do, or we have like, there are other things that we can do. But if that heart is fine, it's the control system that we really want to get after. And then how do we use these little tools or these biomarkers to start to recognize, there's a difference in the brain if the heart rate is too slow than if it's too fast, right? That's pretty obvious. If you've got one side of the heart that's beating differently than the other, then we know that's a thing. We know if we've got we've got like a blockage that's occurring, we know that's a thing. So it allows us to be able to put you in different contexts and understand what that means. So like a good example would be if you and I are sitting there and I'm listening to your heart and it's beating at 80 beats per minute, right? And then I have you turn your head to the right, and then all of a sudden, it pops up to like 100 for a couple seconds, and then it pops back down. That simple motion of turning your head involves some different sensors that have to kick in. So then I can start to hunt down, like, okay, is that coming from something in your neck that's causing that? Is that something that's in your inner ear that's causing that? Is it a dystonia component that's causing that? And then I can start to break it apart and look at, like, what is at the root of this problem. So that's where it gets exciting, and that's why I start talking faster.
Yeah, no, I think those were all really great analogies too of like, and I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, you kind of mentioned it, because we've been talking about the heart rate going up, but some people have the opposite problem. Their heart rate drops,
Mm-hmm.
and sits in maybe the 40s or 50s, which
Mm-hmm.
it's equally as bad, right? It's just different. Um, and like I know I've met people whose heart rates are so low and they can't even get them up. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't have the energy to get their heart rate up. So maybe we should talk about that real briefly too.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it seems like we're always talking about the escape end, like
Hmm.
that rise, because it's super common.
Yep.
I mean, it is, but we also have the other side of that continuum where people can't get their blood pressure up enough. They can't beat their heart fast enough to perfuse their body. Their limbs are cold all the time. They're lightheaded and dizzy all the time. Vasovagal syncope, snazzy word. But that's like
Hmm.
a thing that comes around a lot, where you just be cruising around and then you hit the floor. Not very cool. But these are super common also. Actually, just yesterday, I had this conversation. Or the same sort of thing, but it's on the other end of the spectrum, where we see we're not able to activate the system enough. The one I looked at just yesterday was at rest. Heart rate and blood pressure are both really low. Blood pressure being, kind of like 90 over 45, which is pretty, like, that's not a lot of blood going into your head all the time. You know what I mean? And then the heart rate was around 50, which isn't like crazy low, but it's low enough in that scenario where you'd like it to, pump a little more. So we're getting more blood in. And then, you stand up and you see the same thing. So that didn't really matter. And one of the big things we did is, so we do a grip test where I'll have them grip a dynamometer and just hold it. And we want to see if you can increase your blood pressure that way. And the good news is she can in that context. So we know, like, through an exercise context, she can raise her blood pressure. Like, the system is capable of going up. Just for whatever reason, while she's walking around, that stimulus isn't enough to make it do the normal thing. So we have to then go in and change that calibration so that when she's walking around, those sensors pick up enough to kind of bring her to that normal rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'm glad we mentioned this because I don't want someone watching and being like, well, my heart rate doesn't go up. It sits at 50. I didn't want somebody to be watching and be like, well, my heart
Yeah.
rate isn't going up. But yet they still have the same problem just at the other end of the range, right?
And sometimes that one's actually more dangerous. What we find a lot of in like pots where you're going up is you feel you're going to pass out, but don't always, like, very rarely do people actually pass out. And the other end of the spectrum, where your blood pressure is low and your heart rate's low, those people do pass out, and they do have fall risks and potential to injure themselves
And
again.
hit your head again.
And
Mhm.
and a lot of times you'll go into different contexts or different providers, and they'll be like, man, 50, that's great. Because a lot of times we associate that with athletes, and athletes have a low, just naturally, because they've got some, left ventricular hypertrophy, they can pump a little more per pump. But you don't want big gaps between your heartbeats, because that has to be stabilized. And especially when we think about cardiac arrhythmias and things like that, you want to bring that heart rate kind of back in that normal range. So even though sometimes you'd be like, yeah, mine could be at like 35, you're like, well, that's probably too slow. Even though, there are some marathoners that might make that look real good. So yeah, I'm super glad you brought it up, because it doesn't get talked about very much at
Mhm.
all.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and I think the key here is, if you're not getting answers, because, like we said, the cardiologist is looking at your heart health.
Mm-hmm.
And in all technicality, your heart is fine. It's that brain heart connection, that's having some issues.
Absolutely.
And there is hope. That's the takeaway here is there are doctors like Dr. Keiser who know about this condition, this dysautonomia, and they know how to help you. And I know it can really suck, and it's hard to have doctors telling you you're fine, and
Mhm.
and you're feeling like you're not being heard. So yeah, so thank you for being here. This has been a great
Yeah.
conversation. Again, just an important topic. And I think it's something that affects more TBI people than they might even realize, right? Like there's probably a bunch of us
Mhm.
walking around with dysautonomia that don't even know it.
I think absolutely, and I think I'm really proud to be here and to have you talk about this because it's weird to say, but it's a very vastly underserved group
Hmm.
um, in ways that it's not being recognized, but then it's also there's not a lot of tools to be able to say, okay, here's what we need to do. That's not available everywhere, and it's not available to everyone. So I'm hoping, through talking about it, that we can make that accessible to more people and not just get a bunch of like, well, you're probably anxious
Yeah.
diagnoses,
Yep.
for real problems. So
Yep. That was me. Oh, your heart's just racing because you have anxiety.
mhm, exactly, and that's like almost to a person. That's almost what you hear, and then people will start to go, maybe I am. I
Yeah,
feel
that
kind of
was me.
anxious.
That was
You
me.
know,
Oh, it must just be anxiety. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
It
Well,
kind of
thanks
makes
so
you
much for
feel
having me.
better.
Yeah, to have an identity to it,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But yeah, to a person, you almost always hear that. So I'm glad you're talking about it. I hope we keep talking about it because I think it'll serve a lot of people.
Absolutely. Well, so anyone watching, we have all of Dr. Kaiser's information below this video, but you can find him at drkaiser.com and be sure to follow him on Instagram at Doc Kaiser. He posts tons of great informative videos. I love following you on Instagram. You have lots of really cool stuff on there.
Well, thanks for saying so.
And if anyone wants to learn more about you or see if you're a good fit for working with them, they can reach out and schedule a consultation with you, correct?
Absolutely, be happy to help whoever we can. And even if you're just thinking like maybe we can, um, we'll always try to find someone that's in your area or something that we can do to help you out. So definitely reach out.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any videos in this series. Like this video and head to Amazon to purchase Concussion Discussions.